Hey everybody, welcome back to Borderline. Today we're going to do a video on mixing and how we train someone new in Valley Borders to go ahead and be our mixer. Before we get to all that, though, we're going to go ahead and go through the type of sand that you need, the chemicals that you need to use, and the proper ratio that you need to do as far as Portland and sand to make a proper curbing mix and to make sure that that's easy to finish and it comes out of the machine correctly. So we're going to go ahead and start doing that for you, and hopefully this helps you. Let's first look at our sand. Sand is the biggest issue that we have around the country with people being successful in the curbing business. When we go to different places in the country and train companies, usually the biggest issue that we have is finding the correct sand and making sure that sand can work for what we want it to do. What we have here in Bismarck is they call it a mason sand. And hopefully we can see it. I'll put it a little bit closer here. You can see that it's fairly fine. None of the grains are different sizes. They're all pretty much the same size. There's no real big pebbles in there, and if there's big pebbles in there, you're gonna have some issues with cutting joints and doing certain things. So that's one of the things we need to look at first before you get started in your business, is to make sure that we find the correct sand. Now, most people are going to say, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people will say, you can't use a mason sand because when it comes out of the machine, it wants to slump on you and it doesn't work, so you got to use something with more pebbles to make it stand up, and that's the only thing that we can get to work. And that's true if you're not using the correct chemicals. Okay, there's chemicals that we need to put in here to make this sand work, and if you are using those chemicals, this sand right here is going to make your life so much easier, and you're able to do incredible stamping and carving and certain things like that you can't with any other sand. But those need to be put together. Your sand and your chemicals and your ratios, your mixing ratios, need to be worked with. So after we figure out the sand, and again, this is nice and smooth, there's no pebbles, it's fairly fine. After we get this all taken care of and you find your sand in your area, then we can start working with using the chemicals that you need to, and we'll go through that in a little bit to make this work. But from right now, after the sand, we're going to go talk about mixing ratios to make sure you got the correct amount of sand per bag of Portland, which a lot of people around the country are confused and don't get that correct, which can lead to a lot of problems. Let's talk about our ratio. When we're talking about a curbing mix, it's going to be a little bit different than doing flat work and some of the other things you're talking about, cement trucks and yards of concrete and so on. The best curbing mix is going to be a 4-to-1 ratio, meaning 4-to-1, 4 parts of sand to 1 part of Portland cement. That could be type 1, type 2, type 2, type 5. That's a little bit different discussion, but you're looking at Portland cement. Now, a 4-to-1 ratio, people have gotten kind of confused over the years, not so much confused, but misled maybe years and years ago when they were told in videos and online that basically 4 buckets of sand to 1 bag of Portland is going to be your 4-to-1 ratio. That's not true. 1 bag of Portland cement, meaning a 47-pound bag here in the States, or a half of a 94-pound bag, if you put that into a 5-gallon bucket, it comes up to right here, which is essentially 3 inches short of the top. Okay, so if you're putting 4 complete full buckets of sand into your mix with only 1 bag of Portland cement, you're way higher than a 4-to-1 ratio. You're at least a 4.5-to-1 ratio, which is too much sand to the Portland in there. So you're going to notice that it's hard to trowel. You can't get it smooth. It's very hard to stamp. The one good thing about it is you're getting more footage. So you might be getting 18 to 20 feet of a regular slant style curb with 4 full buckets. But if you're looking at a classic 4-to-1 ratio, what you have in this bucket for Portland, you need to have the same in this bucket times 4. Okay, so I've basically taken this bucket and I filled it up to the same as the Portland. What I would need to do is have 3 more buckets sitting off to the side to make sure I had a 4-to-1 ratio. When we do that, we're only getting 15 to 16 feet of a slant style curb. 6x4 slant style curb is what we kind of base everything off of. So if you're around that 15 to 16 feet, you're using a 47-pound bag, your ratio is pretty close. Now, if you're getting 18 to 20 feet, your ratio is going to be a lot higher. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, less Portland, more sand. It's going to be, your strength is going to be way less because there's less Portland in there. It's going to be a lot rougher. You're not going to be able to get the surfaces smooth. You're going to be more porous. So when you seal that, you're going to use more sealer because it's going to soak into the concrete. Everything about it is going to be more difficult to trowel, to finish, and things like that. So we got to make sure that our concrete ratio and our curbing ratio is correct before we can really do anything else. So we got the sand correct, we get the ratio correct, and then from there we work on what we're going to add for our chemicals, and then our water and what to look for. Now, what we do here at Valley Borders is we don't use buckets. And those of you that have curbed and have been in a mixer and have mixed all day and filling up 4 buckets at a time and putting them in there, what that does to your body is it's pretty incredible. It's obviously very, very difficult. We just use shovels. We have a particular shovel that we've used, a particular size. We've measured how many shovels it takes to get to this spot, and this is 4.5 shovels. So 4.5 shovels, basically times 4, you're looking at 18 shovels. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be 18 shovels for you and your company, because your shovel might be a little bit bigger or smaller, or your guy might be using bigger shovels. When my son mixes, compared to Andrew, who mixes now for us, when my son mixes, he uses a bigger shovel, shovel size. He's using the same shovel, but his shovels are a little bit bigger. And I can notice it right away when I start to finish, that we're maybe getting an extra foot, and it's a little bit harder to trowel. So instead of him using smaller shovels, we have him go from an 18 shovel mix to a 17 shovel mix to get back down to our 15-foot mix. Okay, so that's something that you're going to have to test, and you're going to have to work with whatever shovel you're working with, and so on. Take your buckets the first time you do it, and the first time you're showing a new mixer, get that bucket out there, show them how many shovels it takes to get that bucket to this spot right here, and then that's what you use. For the next 4 or 5 mixes, then when you're training them, you can kind of step off and see how many feet you're getting and how well it trowels and finishes, and then you'll know about what ratio and how correct you are. Now, it's okay to be a foot farther, a foot shorter, I understand that. And a lot of people are going to say, well, you can only be accurate if you're using 4 buckets in there. That's not true either, because yes, we can get a bigger shovel or a smaller shovel each time we go in there, so we're going to be off maybe a half a foot here, off a half a foot there. But I've seen guys do the same thing with buckets. Some of their buckets aren't full all the way, some of the buckets are heaping full like this. So one mix could be 19 feet, the next mix is 22, the next mix is 17. So buckets aren't going to be accurate either, just like a shovel. You got to be able to train your guy to show him what you need to do and how much to put in there, and then take your mixer to where the curb machine is at, show him how many feet we're getting, show him what it looks like when you're finishing, and how good it is, and so on. That's how you should train him. But from here, we need to make sure that you're doing the correct ratio from Portland to sand. Now, if I say 4 buckets and leave it 3 inches short from the top, that's hard for people, some people to understand. If you want to do 3 complete full buckets and another half, that might be easier for people to understand. So I say 3.5 buckets of 5-gallon buckets of sand to 1 bag of Portland. You should be right at that 4-to-1 mix. Or if you leave them short like this, then you'll be close. But just make sure you test it with your slant style curb or your mow curb. It should be fairly close. You should be around that 15 to 16 foot range, and you know you're going to be at about the correct ratio, and you'll know that obviously your finishing and troweling is going to be a lot easier. So from here, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the chemicals that we need to use, and from there we're going to kind of work on the water and what to look for when you're mixing. Okay, now when we do our mixes, okay, the essential order that we put our stuff in, and everybody's a little bit different. You can do a lot of different things and still get the end result that's the same. For us, we always put the sand in first. Okay, so we don't add water to the mixer ahead of time, or put water in the bottom, things like that. It's totally dry. We go ahead and add our sand, which is going to be 3.5 buckets. For us, it's going to be 18 shovels. We go ahead and put that in the mixer. Okay, from there we go ahead and put in the Portland. So go ahead and grab a bag, bust that, we'll put it in there. Now you have your Portland and your sand, and it's just constantly mixing. but it's dry. You want to make sure that's mixing dry. All right. Now from there, we're going to put in, you know, what we call here borderline, we call gravy. Now you can see this is a, you know, kind of a goldish colored powder. This is a water reducer. You know, essentially it's a plasticizer, and this is a very high grade, you know, what they call a super plasticizer. What it's going to do, it's going to reduce the water content in your mix. It takes your water and reduces it by at least 50%. Okay, so if you were curbing before and you haven't used anything like this, what we would tell you to do is now try to use a finer sand. Go to your yard and get that mason sand that they've always had over there that you couldn't use before. Try it, put it into your mix, go ahead and add your chemical in there, and then start adding your water slowly. Once the water activates with this chemical, okay, with your plasticizer, it starts to basically essentially kind of multiply in there. So before, let's say you were measuring your water and you were adding it to the mix, and you might have put 2 gallons in there. Sometimes it's more or less depending on how dry or how wet your sand is, because there's water content in your sand. But if you were putting a couple gallons of water in there to get the mix that you felt was correct when it came out of the machine, now by using the finer sand and you're using, you know, a chemical like this, like the gravy that we sell here at Borderline, and you put that in there, you'll find out that if you put that 2 gallons of water in there, it's going to be a sloppy mess, okay, because it's way too much water. What we do here is we use a hose and we add it in with the hose so we can test every mix exactly the same. We don't measure water and put it in there, because that doesn't work either, because your sand might be wetter on the bottom of the bin than it is on the top. So measuring your water per gallon doesn't work either. So you have to spray it in, and that guy up here has to make sure that he knows how to test that mix to where it's going to be perfect. Okay, we've measured how much water we're putting in a particular mix with this sand, with this chemical, and we're right at a gallon, maybe just a little bit more than a gallon of water, and that looks wet and it feels wet. Okay, but since it's a finer sand, there's less water in it, there's less water weight. That finer sand now will come out of the machine standing up, because it doesn't have that water weight to slump. Okay, so now by using this, you can use the finer sand, and everything on that end, when it comes to working with the curb machine and finishing and stamping, is much easier, because that curb over there is a lot softer. There's no big pebbles in it, so you can get deeper stamps, and everything is easier about it. Okay, but this will lead directly to what sand you can use, and vice versa. Once you get that down and get your water down and train your mixer and things like that, you can get everything correct on that end. It takes guys that have curbed 10, 15 years with a different sand and not using this. It takes them 5, 6, 7 mixes to kind of get used to what this feels like, what it looks like, and what it should look like coming out of the machine, because they're used to something different for so long. So this is very important to get that sand correct. And if this is all correct on this end where the mixer is, the end, that end where the curb machine is and the finishing is really pretty simple. You shouldn't have to be working really hard over there to get that curb smooth, to get your stamp correct, all that stuff. That should be simple, because that should be taken care of right here. I want to point out one thing too. Guys are going to say, if you go to a finer sand, it's not going to be, your curb's not going to be as strong. You got to realize too, guys, that landscape curbing that's going around your house is not designed to be driven over by a car. Okay, your PSI rating for landscape curbing that goes around your house, is going to be in the 22 to 2,500 pound range, PSI range. If a car drives over that and you got softer ground underneath, or it's ground underneath, that can crack. That's just the way it is. It has nothing to do with the sand or anything like that. It's not designed to be driven over. If you're using bigger aggregates and putting things in your mix, like some pea gravel, or if you're using sand that's got more pebbles in it and things like that, yeah, that concrete's probably going to be a little bit stronger. But to get it as smooth and work with it easier, it's not even close. Now, you have to realize too, and you can look this up, by reducing the amount of water in your mix, okay, which this does, it compensates for you having a finer sand, because reducing the water makes your concrete stronger. Okay, the less water that's in a mix, the less fluid it is, the weaker it is, because once that water evaporates, you know, in a slab it'll evaporate in 28 days, totally cure. Once that evaporates, now you got pores in that slab that it's not as condensed, it's not as dense. So the less water you have, to a point, less water you have in your mix, the stronger that curb is. So okay, so we're going to a finer sand. Yep, there's less pebbles in there, it's not going to be as strong because we have a finer sand. But since we're using a water reducer, we're reducing the water by 50%, that's going to make your curb much stronger than it originally would have been. Okay, so going to a finer sand and using this will make your curb stronger than using a rougher concrete sand without using this. So strength and PSI, that's not an issue when it comes to this, because your curb is going to be more dense, there's going to be less pores in there, and it's going to be stronger PSI ways.